Welcome back. In our last lecture, we traced the Israelite monarchy from the fall of the dynasty of Omri to the fall of the Assyrian Empire, roughly the 8th and 7th centuries BC. We looked at the prosperity enjoyed by Israel and Judah under the kings Jeroboam II and Uzziah. Then we chronicled the rise and fall of the Assyrian Empire. This led us to look at the ministry of the prophet Isaiah, especially as he mediated the word of God to the kings of Judah in the time of the Syro-Ephraimite crisis and the devastating crisis of 701 BC, when Sennacherib surrounded the city of Jerusalem. We concluded our discussion of those two tumultuous centuries with a brief discussion of the work of the prophets Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk. This laid the foundation for the rise and fall of the Babylonian Empire, which will be the agent of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, the fall of the southern kingdom, and the experience of Israel known as the exile. Those events will be the major topic of our next lecture. Having been embroiled in much history and theology in the past two lectures, I thought it good that we step back for a moment and look at some of the other developments of the Old Testament period that exerted influence on the developing history and thought of the various writers. Hence, in this lecture, I want to talk about religion, especially the religion of Yahweh as it's contrasted to the religion of the Canaanites. It was a form of Canaanite religion, worship of Baal and El, that was practiced by Jezebel, and through her and her daughter exerted such great influence in the lands of Israel and Judah. We mentioned it with regards to Jezebel and Elijah, but what precisely was it, and why was it so influential? Next, we'll take a look at the lives of ordinary people in the lands of Israel and Judah. What was their life like? How did they live? How were they educated? What was family life like? What are some of their marriage customs? Knowledge of these things will give us a deeper insight into the writings of the prophets, and even more significantly into the writings of authors such as the author of Proverbs and Sirach and Job, who are considered authors of the writings. Finally, we'll take a look at the religious life of the people who practiced Yahwism. What was their liturgy like? What feasts did they celebrate, and how? Who were the officiants of their liturgical services? In this, we'll examine the temple, the priesthood, and temple prayer. A large part of the prayer life of the people has been preserved in the book of Psalms in the Old Testament. This material should not be as involved or heavy as the last lectures. It will give some significant material, but it will also allow us a little space to breathe. Recall that in the first class, we said that God promised Abraham the land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. That's Genesis 15:18. One of the groups that dwelt in that land was the Canaanites. These Canaanites are descendants of Canaan, son of Ham, son of Noah. The land they inhabited was along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, including the area of modern-day Lebanon, parts of Syria, and most of Palestine west of the Jordan River. Boat describes the territory of the Canaanites as the whole Mediterranean coast, from Turkey down to the border of Egypt. This was a good portion of Israel that was taken over by the Israelites after the conquest of Joshua, and much of the land occupied by the Phoenicians when they came down from the north. The territory was ultimately given two names: Palestine for the southern section, which encompassed many of the older Philistine cities there. Note, our name Palestine has as its ultimate origin the term Philistine. The other name was Phoenicia for the northern section, drawn from a Greek term phoenix, referring to the purple dye made in that region. With the discovery of the Rashamra tablets, it was clear that the Canaanites were polytheists, that is, they believed in many gods. The tablets tell of the exploits of several Canaanite gods. These gods were clearly connected to the agricultural society of the people. They brought about rains and fertility that produced significant crops. They withheld the rains when they were upset with the people. So their worship basically became a means of appeasing them to gain their favor and ultimately have a good crop. So who were these Canaanite gods? At the top of the pecking order in the pantheon was the god El. He is clearly the high god, the head of the divine assembly. The Ugaritic texts describe him as dwelling at the source of the rivers. A further epithet is Bull El, demonstrating his strength. He's also known as the creator of creatures. Of all the Canaanite gods, El is the one who was least involved in human affairs. We see the influence of El in Israelite religion, in that prior to the revelation of the name in Exodus 3, we see Israel's God Yahweh addressed as El Elyon, or El Shaddai, the God of the mountaintop. This will cause some confusion when Israel will bring Yahwism into the Canaanite world. Also, Israelite names, even the very name Israel, are compounded with El. Israel is Yisra, El, meaning Yisra, he saw El, God. Jacob fought with the angel, in which he saw God and still he lived. And his name was changed from Jacob to Israel. Also names such as Daniel, the Lord El is my judge, Dan. Gabriel, the Lord El is my strength, Gav. Michael, who, me, is like Ka, God, El, are compounded with the name of the god El. And so we can see a similarity between the god Yahweh, Israel's God, and the god El, the Canaanite god. Next in the pantheon comes Baal, who is the god of the storm cloud. His name simply means Lord, Master, or Owner. In the Rashamra texts, Baal dwelt in Mount Zaphon. He is a storm god who controlled the rains, the thunders, the lightning. As such, he possessed power of all the wind and weather. Therefore, one certainly needed Baal on their side to achieve a good crop and harvest. Some texts go so far as to list Baal as son of El. In some iconography, Baal is depicted as riding on the storm clouds. That image is somewhat telling when we look at the 7th chapter of Daniel, where one like a son of man is seen coming riding on the storm clouds to be presented to the Ancient of Days. Daniel 7:13. Could there be a bit of Baal and El? The Canaanite pantheon is not all male. There are 3 female goddesses. The first is the consort or wife of El, Asherah. The etymology of her name could be shiny, bright, happy, or upright. In Canaan, metal or terracotta figurines of female goddesses have been discovered. These sometimes were worn like necklaces, or sometimes they were seen as holding an arrow or a quiver, the goddess that is, or holding sacrificial animals, snakes, or lotus blossoms. Most of these statues depicting the goddess Asherah, and even have given them the names Asheroth. It was Asheroth that were decried by the Hebrew prophets as representing all fertility worship. The second female goddess is Anat or Anath. Her name means force or violence. True to her name, she's a volatile and feisty woman who's depicted as a huntress with hunting and vanquishing both human and divine foes. Further, she appears to be the consort to Baal, and as such may have entered into the fertility cult. Both sees parallels between Anat and the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, who was a goddess of love and war at the same time. The final female of the major players in the pantheon is Astarte. The meaning of her name is obscure. Some see it as a form of the deified planet Venus, the morning star. Venus, as well as her Greek counterpart Aphrodite, is the goddess of love in Greco-Roman mythology. So, Astarte is heavily involved in the fertility cult as a goddess of love, fertility, and motherhood. As with Asherah, small statuettes of Astarte were found in both ruins of Israelite and Canaanite settlements. There are yet a few lesser gods in the Canaanite pantheon who exerted influence on the cult: Mot, Yam, Dagon, Shemesh, and Yarek. Mot, or Maweth, is the god of death. In fact, in Hebrew, the word for death is Maweth, or Mot. The Rosh Hashanah texts describe him as a powerful, immortal figure. He represents the death-dealing sterility of the summer heat and the drought that swallows up the crops. He lives in the underworld. Yam is the god of the sea. He gets his name from the Hebrew word for sea, or Yam. Yam depicts the chaotic aspect of the waters. He's identified with many of the sea serpents who cause the chaos of the waters. In the Rosh Hashanah texts, Baal is depicted in a fight for power with Yam, which of course Baal wins, subduing the forces of chaos and destruction from the waters. But as some point out, it might also show Baal's protection of the sailors. Now, the notion of creation in the Old Testament is seen as putting order into chaos. And one of the places where order is imposed on chaos is the waters. The firmament separates the waters above from the waters below, putting each in its place. The dry land separates the waters below. The ordering of chaos thus is putting things in their place and is a creative act of God. In mythological terms, it is God's power over the forces of chaos, represented by many of the foreign gods. For example, Yam and his subordinates, Rahab and the dragon. A text from Isaiah 51 illustrates this. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in days of old, as in ages long ago, Was it not you who crushed Rahab? You who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep? You who made the depths of the sea into a way for the redeemed to pass through. That's Isaiah 51, 9-10. There is a reference there to two distinct events, both of which are interpreted as salvific. The first has to do with the battle of Baal and Ya'am, in which Rahab and the dragon are subordinates of the Canaanite god Yam. The Old Testament sees them as being ordered from exerting chaos on the earth by God, who crushed Rahab and pierced the dragon. This is yet another way of describing what God did in creation in Genesis 1. And so creation here is seen as a saving act. The second is God drying up the sea, Yam, so that the people can pass through in the Exodus, an act that saved them from the Egyptians. We can see this Canaanite mythology exerting then its influence on the Old Testament. Another of the minor gods is Dagon. Etymologically, this will connect it with the Hebrew dag, which means fish. Hence, he's seen as a fish god. Others see the name coming from a word which means corn or grain. Neither of these views has great support. The earliest sources mention Dagon as a storm god, from a root meaning to be stormy or cloudy. The Rosh Hashanah texts identify Dagon as the Rosh Hashanah texts identify Baal as the son of Dagon. It's also interesting to note that the temple that Samson destroyed when he regained his strength was a temple of Dagon, the national god of the Philistines. The final pair is Shemesh and Yarik. Shemesh is the Canaanite sun god, from a root meaning to be bright or brilliant. In fact, Shemesh is the Hebrew word for sun. His influence is seen in place names such as Beth Shemesh or Shamash Edom in Palestine. The feminine form for the sun god or the goddess was Shapash. Closely connected with Shemesh is Yarik, the moon god. To see the workings of many of these gods, read the religious myth of Baal in Bot, pages 219 to 220. Further, Bot shows how the Canaanite myth has exerted influence in the Old Testament. Texts describing Yahweh as a warrior who triumphs over his enemies owe their origin to such Canaanite religious texts. Throughout the history, Israel has had to battle against Canaanite religious systems such as this Canaanite mythology. Yet the influence of this mythology is very clear and can be seen clearly in the Old Testament. Now we turn to everyday life in the 7th and 8th centuries. As Israel emerged in the period of Judges, she was transformed from a nomadic traveling people to a somewhat settled group with land and territory she could call her own. That's manifest in the division of the land among the tribes that we spoke about. This also led to a switch from being primarily a pastoral people, tending flocks as they moved, to being a more sedentary, stationary people interested now in agriculture. With the advent of the monarchy, yet another change occurred. Larger settlements and cities began to emerge, most particularly the capital city of Jerusalem, and with the division of the kingdom, the capital city of Samaria. A rivalry between these urban centers and the more traditional tribal outposts would be evident in the years to come. Cities in the period of the monarchy were a medium size, 3 to 7 hectares, between 7 and 17 acres. But the capital cities of Jerusalem and Samaria were quite a bit larger, up to 30 to 50 hectares, between 74 and 123 acres. For protection and defense, these cities were built on a hill and usually had large walls around them. These walls were double in strength, and sometimes homes were built into the area between the two defensive walls, as was the case with the home of Rachel in the book of Judges. Not Rachel, Rahab in the book of Judges. The city had a series of administrative buildings from which the government of the city took place. The higher in rank of the hierarchy of the city, the larger were its administrative buildings. These were grouped together at a higher elevation. In particular, these buildings were composed of a palace for the king, if it was the capital, or for the governor of a lesser city, the storehouses of the city, open spaces for marketplaces, and encampments for the army. Also in this area, one would find the religious center of the city. In Jerusalem, this was the great temple of Jerusalem, built by Hiram of Tyre under the direction of Solomon the king. Another key element of the city was the water system. It was crucial that water be supplied to the city. Many of the cities were built along rivers to provide that water. Others were built such that an aqueduct system could bring water to the city. As water is a necessity of life, one cannot have a city without a proper water system. We saw that in the water systems at Jerusalem, Megiddo, and Hatzor. The larger cities were also known for their networks of streets. The prime plan for the street networks developed into what was known later on as the Hippodamian plan, which called for a city to be divided into quarters by two major intersecting thoroughfares. The first, a north-south street, which was known as the Cardo. This draws its name from the Latin word for hinge, cardo cardinus. That street becomes a hinge on which the whole city, north to south, turns. Some, however, prefer to see it coming from the Greek cardia, meaning heart, because it also delineates the heart of the city. My personal preference is the first, not the second. Intersecting at right angles with this cardo is an east-west street known as the decumanus. These two major streets, in effect, divide a city into four quarters. The old city of Jerusalem, as it exists today, shows that division. There is a street in the center of the city known as the Roman Cardo, and the city is divided thereby through the Cardo and Decumanus into four quarters: the Jewish quarter, the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, and the Armenian quarter. Now, this is a rather modern division, yet the notion of division into quarters is quite ancient. Just outside the main gate, one would find the major public square, which would also be protected by a set of gates further out, which were there for defense against enemies. The marketplace could also be found there, as one sees in the old city of Jerusalem, where the major Arab market is found just inside the Damascus gate of the walls of the city. The next topic is how the ancient Israelites view the human person, what's known as Semitic anthropology. The human being in the Semitic world is seen in a significantly different way from the human being in the Greco-Roman world, our world. Our general notion of a human being is that we are composed of body and soul. The body is temporary, while the soul is immortal. That's not the case in the Semitic world. A human being is actually an enlivened body. The basic component of the human being is the basar, which means body or flesh. This body or flesh is then enlivened with the breath of life, which is the nefesh, thus making it an enlivened body. The one cannot operate without the other. That's clear from Genesis 2:6. The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living soul, a nefesh chaya. In the Semitic understanding, the nefesh is carried in the blood, the dam. Hence the understanding that one does not eat blood or drink blood. The reason being that consuming blood is to consume the life force of the being whose blood it is. Thus, consuming the blood of an animal would give one the life force of an animal. Also, we see the role of blood in the story of Cain and Abel, when Cain kills Abel. The text tells us that Abel's blood cries out to God from the ground. Now you, Cain, are banned from the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. On a higher level is the spirit, ruach. This can be vitality or life-giving power. The Psalms make several references to the spirit, and Genesis speaks of the Ruach Adonai, the Spirit of God, hovering above the face of the deep at creation. Boat cites Psalm 51, a psalm to illustrate the notion of spirit. The psalm says, "Create a pure heart in me, O God, and put in me a new and steadfast spirit, Ruach. Cast me not out from before you, and do not take from me your Holy Spirit." Psalm 51, 10 through 11. Another key term is lave, which is translated heart. Now, heart does not do justice to the term. In Semitic anthropology, the heart is the center of the intellectual life. It's much more akin to what we would call mind. For that reason, we find lave in Hebrew translated in several places as mind, to get a sense rather than the literal sense of the translation. For example, Deuteronomy 6:5 says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, lave, with all your soul, nefesh, and with all your strength, me'oth." In other words, we're to love God with everything that we have. When cited in the New Testament, the translations add a term, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This addition gets at what the Semitic understanding of the term lave is. One question remains. If the heart, which in our understanding is the center of emotions, is in Semitic understanding the center of the intellectual and the volitional, where in the Semitic understanding is the center of emotions? Well, it's in the guts, or more closely, more clearly, the kidney. We get at the understanding a bit when we refer to a courageous man as one who has guts. Now let's move on to the family and family life. The family was a key structure in the social world of the Old Testament. Families were patriarchal in structure. It was thus the father who made decisions. The mother would go along with the father's decisions, since he was the head of the house, the family, and many times the clan. The early history of Israel imbued the people with a sense of clan and clan loyalty. This could be a good thing in that it would ensure that members of the various surrounding tribes would come to defend and protect if part of the clan were being attacked. But on the other hand, a large part of the clan could be punished if one provoked an enemy. The institution of marriage was considered sacred. Divorce was permitted, but there were strict laws both in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that regulated it. Also, it was only the prerogative of the husband to divorce his wife. A wife could not divorce her husband. If the husband died, leaving the wife alone, the rest of the clan or community would be obliged to care for her. Widows had very little standing in that society, so all members were obliged to attend to and care for widows and orphans. As the Lord said in Exodus, "If you do not care for the widow and the orphan, I will strike your wives. I will strike you, and your wives will be widows and your children orphans." Further, what's known as the Levirate law demanded that if a man married and died leaving his widow childless, it was incumbent upon his brother to take his widow and marry her to provide children for his brother. Children were educated by the mother in the family during their earlier years. She was the prime educator, both in the practical things of life and the religious tenets. When a boy became old enough, approximately 12 years, he would leave the side of his mother and join his father as an apprentice to learn the things that he would need to know to continue in the world as a man. Girls would be taught further by their mothers how to be good wives and mothers themselves. When the time came for marriage, most were arranged by the parents, who chose a partner for their children. The father of the prospective bride was very instrumental in determining who it was that his daughter would marry. Parents could arrange weddings for their children for several reasons. Weddings took place in two stages. First, there was a betrothal, which was a legally binding proposal. Two families would come together and give a boy and a girl to be married. During this time of betrothal, they would continue to live in their own homes, and their families would negotiate the proper terms of the marriage. Daughters were considered to be the property of their fathers, and the fathers were then in marriage transferring ownership of the daughter from themselves to the prospective husband. For this to occur, it was necessary that some commodities be exchanged, that is, a dowry. Thus, marriage had a business side to it. Ironically, in the process of all this preparation, a prospective bride and groom might not meet each other until the day of marriage. The marriage is actually the transfer of the bride from the house of her father to the house of her prospective husband. Once the bride arrives, the wedding ceremony takes place, and after the ceremony, a rather large celebration, many times involving most of the town. One institution that was significant in ancient Israel that's not part of our experience is the institution of slavery. It was common practice in all the nations that surrounded Israel, and thus it was permitted in Israel. However, slaves in Israel were usually foreigners. The Torah prohibited having people of Israel as slaves, most likely because the people of Israel had had the experience of being slaves to the Egyptians at the time of the Exodus, and had through Moses won their freedom. Nevertheless, we find members of the people of Israel in slavery. Exodus and Deuteronomy make provisions for a person to sell himself into slavery in order to pay debts, usually for a period of 7 years. Many see little difference between the life of the slave and the life lived by the poorer sections of society. The big difference was that the slave was property owned by his master. Therefore, slaves had no legal rights. Children born to slaves were owned by the master of the slaves and could not be freed even after the required 7-year period. Mistreatment and murder of slaves was treated much more lightly than the same of a free person. Boat notes that two circumstances led people in Israel to be slaves. First, poverty would force people into slavery just to live. Here the slave was treated with a certain amount of dignity during the time that the slavery lasted. The second situation was prisoners of war, who were brought back in chains. These foreigners were forced to do menial work in mines or on ships or other places, usually for the rest of their lives. Even in the New Testament, we see vestiges of slavery in the society of the day. One thing that was seen as certainty was death. For the people of Israel, death was seen as a finality. The notion of afterlife and resurrection did not enter into Jewish theology until relatively late. It emerges from theological reflection on events in the Maccabean revolt. The writings of Israel see little to be happy about in death. For most of the history of Israel, death is seen as destruction. It is a return of the person to the dust from which the person came forth in the first place. The grave is simply referred to as the pit, from which the jaws of death swallow the person. After death, the person goes to Sheol, a place of ordeal, darkness, and helplessness. The Psalms capture the feelings about death well. Like one forgotten among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more. Psalm 88:5. This certainly does not give a happy view of death. The dead seem to be forgotten even by God, simply lying in their graves. In the prophets, death seems almost personified. This may be due to the influence of the Canaanite myths, where the god Mot is a real person engaging Baal in battle. Death grabs people and imprisons them, but before Yahweh death is powerless, similar to Baal vanquishing Mot in the Canaanite myth. Our final segment will look at the Israelite cult and its hymns as found in the book of Psalms. The rituals of worship and sacrifice comprise what we call cult. Boat notes that the cult of Jewish worship emerges through 4 periods of Israel's history: the patriarchal period, the period of the covenant with Moses, the period of the temple, and the renewed cult after the exile. In the stories of the patriarchs, we see encounters with God taking place around special trees or on the tops of mountains. These were located in what would become later shrines, such places as Gilgal, Bethel, Moriah. This respect for trees and mountains was not just found among the Israelites. It was also characteristic of the Canaanite religion. In part, this had to do with the patriarchal Israel being a nomadic people, a traveling people. They took their gods with them, and God was referred to as the God of the fathers. Religion was something that was connected with the people, not connected with any particular place, since the people were not, in the patriarchal period, connected to any particular place. With Moses' experience on Sinai, Israel's God revealed a name, Yahweh, which is given the meaning I am who am, or I am who causes to be. in Hebrew Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. On Sinai, Israel entered into covenant with their God, Yahweh. This covenant was commemorated in ceremonies involving sprinkling, blood, and renewal of promises. Also, in this covenant, Yahweh imparted directions for the construction of two mobile places of worship: the tent of meeting and the tent of the Ark of the Covenant. The tent of meeting was a place where God spoke directly to Moses and the elders of the clans. As Israel settled down, the purpose of this tent was taken over by a more permanent structure. The Ark of the Covenant was a box carried by poles, as seen in this picture. It was seen as the seat of Yahweh amidst his people. It contained the 10 Commandments, written on 2 stones given to Moses, and later tradition has it contain the staff of Aaron and a portion of the manna. The ark was the visible sign of Yahweh's presence among his people during the period of conquest and the period of the Confederacy. As we saw, when David became king and had built his palace, he wanted to build a house for God. This desire saw its fulfillment in the great temple of Jerusalem built by Hiram of Tyre, with the support of Solomon, son of David. This temple was constructed in the style of the time, with 3 sections: the porch, the holy place or the devir, and the Holy of Holies, the Hekal. The porch was outside the building. It was rather narrow, and it served as a solemn entranceway. The main chamber of the temple was known as the Holy Place. It was raised several steps from the ground level and was also known as the sanctuary. Within the Holy Place was the altar of incense and the table of showbread. Around the Holy Place were found several lampstands. From the Holy Place, another set of steps took one to the Holy of Holies, which was a dark curtained enclosure housing the Ark of the Covenant. This chamber was restricted. Only the high priest could enter it, and that was allowed only once a year in the course of the ritual surrounding the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Outside the temple, there was a large bronze sea, sitting on 12 bronze oxen. Opposite it was the great altar of holocausts, where sacrifices were immolated in the course of temple ritual. This great temple of Solomon was the center of worship of Yahweh for all the kingdom. After Solomon's death, recall, the kingdom split, and Jeroboam, the northern leader, set up his 2 cultic centers at Bethel and Dan to keep people from traveling to Jerusalem to worship. What form did worship in this temple take? The central aspect of the temple ritual was animal sacrifice. Through the sacrifice of animals, human beings would return as a gift to God the life that God had given them as a gift. Thus, key in the ritual was the sprinkling of the animal's blood on the altar. Recall from our discussion on anthropology earlier that the life force was contained in the blood. Hence, the sprinkling of animal's blood is its life offered back to God. Further, the killing of the animal represented its being taken from everyday service to be given to God alone. Sacrifices were offered to express thanksgiving, but also sacrifices were offered to make petition, to express guilt for sin, or to show trust in the fact that God will deliver them from calamity. What marked Israel's sacrifices as different from the rest of the ancient world was they were not magical rituals meant to make God act in a certain way. Israel's sacrifices manifest the people's adoration, silence, and obedience before God. When Israel did not offer sacrifice in this mode, They were rebuked by the prophets. As you read both, you will see that in the temple ritual there were several different kinds of sacrifices and offerings specified in the law. Passover was originally a nomadic celebration, which was meant to provide fertility for the flock. With the Exodus, it came to celebrate the passing of the Israelites from Egypt through the Red Sea, which gained them freedom from Egyptian bondage. Once the people had arrived in the land, the celebration of Passover was linked to another agricultural feast known as unleavened bread, which originally sought to secure fecundity of the crops and giving thanks for the harvest of barley and new flour in the spring. This feast of unleavened bread, which lasted 8 days, was linked to the feast of Passover and produced a week-long celebration of the freedom won by the Israelites and their return to take possession of their land. The ritual for Passover is laid out in the book of Exodus, chapter 12. Next is the Feast of Pentecost, or Weeks. This celebration took place 50 days after Passover, during the early wheat harvest. The Greek term Pentekostes means 50, hence the name Pentecost. The feast commemorates the giving of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. It reminds the people of the command of God that their first fruits of their harvest are to be brought and offered to God. It is this Jewish feast of Pentecost that forms the backdrop to the story of the descent of the Spirit upon the apostles in Acts. The Spirit descends, and Peter, speaking for the whole group, preaches to the assembled pilgrims for Pentecost the wonders of Jesus' death and resurrection. That becomes the Christian feast of Pentecost, which really has its roots in this Jewish feast. The next major feast is the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles. This is known in Hebrew as Sukkoth, which means tent, or tents. The feast takes place in the fall in a festival of 8 days, celebrating the wine and late grain harvest. During this time, the people could not leave the fields, and so they set up tents in which to sleep during the harvest. That practice of setting up a small sukkah outside the house for the feast grew once they were no longer in fields. Eventually, it was joined to the desert wandering of Israel after the Sinai covenant as a commemoration of it. And ultimately, it expresses the rejoicing of the people in their thanksgiving for the gift of the land. Rosh Hashanah, literally the head of the year, is the Jewish New Year's celebration. Many times it's celebrated slightly before Sukkoth. As with our traditions concerning the new year of making resolutions to root out vices in our lives, Rosh Hashanah stresses the need for forgiveness. It emphasizes the prayer to God to forgive the faults of the past year and allow one to move forward with a clean slate. Continuing the theme of forgiveness, Rosh Hashanah was followed 10 days later by the feast of Yom Kippur, which literally means Day of Atonement. This is the most solemn day in the Jewish calendar. It would, in some senses, approximate our Good Friday for somberness and solemnity. The rituals for Yom Kippur involve the high priest doing formal penance for the sins of the people and his own sins, having entered the Holy of Holies to make petition before God. Then the sins of the people, are laid upon one goat, and the sins of the high priest on another. The second goat is slaughtered, sacrificed, while the first is run out of town into the desert, bearing the sins of the people. Evil spirits in the desert supposedly would kill the goat, and the sins would be subsumed into them. Herein lies the origin of the term scapegoat. On the first day of the month, a special celebration took place. This was known as the new moon. We see this in the prophet Amos, where the merchants want the celebration of the new moon ended, so they can get back to cheating their customers, diminishing the ephah and increasing the shekel. Another recurring celebration is the Sabbath, or Shabbat, celebrated on the seventh day of the week. This goes back to the creation narrative where God worked for 6 days of the week on creation, but on the seventh day he rested. Hence the command of the third commandment to rest on the Lord's day, the Sabbath day, or Shabbat, and keep it holy. Also, you will recall that on the day before Shabbat, during the desert wandering, a double portion of manna was given, which was to cover the needs of the people on the Sabbath. In Jewish reckoning, this day of Shabbat is what we call Saturday. In the Christian calendar, because the resurrection took place on the first day of the week, we celebrate our Shabbat on Sunday. 2 other feasts have their origins in periods of Israel's history we have not yet studied: Purim and Hanukkah. The Feast of Purim, which comes from a Hebrew word meaning lot, commemorates yet another deliverance of the people. This time God delivers the Jews in Persia from a plot of one Haman, who persuaded the Persian king Ahasuerus to destroy all of the Jews in the Persian kingdom on a day, to be chosen through the drawing of lots, hence the name. The king's wife, Queen Esther, foils the plot of Haman and saves her people. It is celebrated on the 14th day of the last month of the year, and its story is found in the book of Esther, chapter 9. The final feast of the Jews that we want to talk about is Hanukkah, which is celebrated beginning on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, which usually occurs during our December, somewhat close to the celebration of our Christmas. It commemorates the rededication of the Temple of Jerusalem and its altar after its desecration by Antiochus Epiphanes IV, the Seleucid king. This rededication took place in 165-164 BC. The festival centers itself on the relighting of the menorah in the temple. Hence, it's also known as the Feast of Lights. Our final topic today is the Book of Psalms, which one could aptly call the hymnal of the Jerusalem temple. Many scholars have seen the Book of Psalms subdivided into 5 books. The first would be Psalms 1 to 41, which is a collection of psalms attributed to David. The second, Psalms 42 to 72, would be a collection of hymns which have their origins in the northern kingdom. The third, Psalm 73 to 89, is a collection from the temple. The fourth, Psalms 90 to 106, is from a royal collection, perhaps psalms used in the New Year's celebration. And the fifth and final section of the book, Psalms 107 to 150, are a second set of psalms attributed to David, containing a large number of what we would call royal psalms. The psalms are poetic, hymnic compositions which praise God for the wonders of his creation, thank God for some favor granted, express lament of the community or of an individual over a particular situation in life. Other psalms extol the king. These are known as royal psalms. Included in that category would also be psalms that praise Yahweh as King of Israel. Finally, there were actual hymns, which would be liturgical in nature. Most of the Psalms had their origin in the liturgy of the Temple of Jerusalem. Some were written for a particular celebration in the temple. For example, the Passover, or the celebration of the New Year. A number of Psalms speak of going up to Jerusalem. These may have been Psalms that people sung as pilgrims when pilgrim groups approached the city of Jerusalem, and in particular the temple, as they came to celebrate one of the great pilgrimage feasts. Other Psalms may have the gate of the city or the gate of the temple as their place of origin. Psalm 118, for instance, depicts the people of Jerusalem gathered on the walls of the city, waiting to welcome the king back to the city after a fierce battle. The psalm is an antiphonal arrangement between the people on the city walls and the entourage of the approaching king. It leads up to the gates being opened and the king entering the city. Through these psalms, we can see that the cult was very much connected to the everyday life of the people, and the songs of the cult express that. Well, that's about all we have time for this week. Next time, we'll resume our historical study of Israel, concentrating on the reform of Josiah, the fall of the southern kingdom, and the exile. Key in all of this is the ministry of the prophet Jeremiah, who I like to dub a prophet for our own times. See you then.